So good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I hope we're going to have a productive and enjoyable time together this morning. I'm very happy to be here to celebrate the life and work of Nicholas Kaldor, such a great man, and I would like to thank Laszlo for inviting me, and perhaps I should say that he couldn't have invited a more Kaldorian economist as myself. I knew Nicky quite well. Not as well, of course, as his family, his daughters who are here, his grandchild, nor even perhaps as well as Robert Skidelsky, but I knew him pretty well. In the mid-1970s, I'd already decided that I was going to write an intellectual biography of Kaldor. I found him such an interesting man, and I liked his economics very much. And in 1979, I had a sabbatical term in Cambridge, where I was able to go and listen to his lectures. I was able to talk to him, and I finished reading all of his published works, over 200 articles and books altogether. And then in 1985-86, I had a whole sabbatical year in Cambridge, and most of that time I spent in the house in Adams Road, sorting out his papers, reading his correspondence, interviewing him extensively. I have about 20 hours of tapes of conversations between us. And then in 87, alas, after he died, my project was finished. The book was published, an intellectual biography of Nicholas Kaldor. Since that, incidentally, there have been two other biographies of Kaldor, one by the Italian economist Ferdinando Targetti, and the other by, well, he's British, but by John King, who teaches at La Trobe University. So there are like three full intellectual biographies of him. Now, as Laszlo just said, this is the 30th anniversary of Nicky's death. And in the foreword to my biography, Douglas Wass, who was the permanent secretary to the Treasury when Nicky Kaldor was the special economic advisor there in the 1960s and in the 1970s, says when he heard of the news of Nicky's death, I quote, "I was affected like the poet's friend, who, on hearing the news, could only say over and over again, 'Coleridge is dead, Coleridge is dead.'" Now, undoubtedly, economics lost one of its most original and controversial economists of the 20th century. We're all mortal, of course, but not many of us live the sort of rich intellectual and political life that Kaldor led. So before I get into why I became a Kaldorian, I want to give, by way of background, a few highlights of his career for those who perhaps don't know. It was in 1927 that he left Budapest to go to the LSE in London to study economics. He graduated with a first-class degree in 1930. He was given a research studentship by Lionel Robbins, and then in 1932 he was appointed to the staff. During the 1930s, he made fundamental contributions to economic theory at a very young age, to the theory of the firm, to trade cycle theory, to capital theory, to welfare economics, and not the least to the Keynesian revolution. He was one of the first to be converted at the LSE to the Keynesian revolution. And after he'd given the Hicks lecture in Oxford in 1985, John Hicks wrote to him and said, "Your 1939 paper entitled Speculation and Economic Stability was the culmination of the Keynesian revolution in theory. You ought to have had more honor for it." Now that, I thought, was a very nice accolade. In the 1940s, when the LSE was actually evacuated to Cambridge, he and Keynes collaborated a lot on concepts of national income accounting, also on war finance. And Kaldor also made substantial contributions to the two Beveridge reports, one on social insurance in 1942 and the other on full employment in a free society in 1944. Then in 1947, he got the invitation, as the previous speaker said, to become the director of the Research and Planning Division at the Economic Commission for Europe, headed by Gunnar Myrdal. Lionel Robbins, because Lionel Robbins and Kaldor were very much in conflict at this particular point, because Robbins never accepted the Keynesian revolution. Robbins refused him leave of absence from the London School of Economics, so he resigned from the London School of Economics to take up this post in Geneva. He stayed for 2 years. He once described, I don't know whether this is true or whether the daughters would also confirm this, but he once said to me, those 2 years in Geneva were the happiest of his life. But it wasn't long after he got to Geneva that he got this offer from King's College, Cambridge, to become a fellow in the footsteps, you might say, of Keynes, to be a fellow of King's College and a lecturer in economics in the Faculty of Economics. So he was in Geneva at the EC for 2 years, but then left to Cambridge, and that was his academic base for the rest of his life. Then in 1951, he was appointed to the Royal Commission on the taxation of profits and income. Now this was very significant because it introduced him for the first time to tax matters. And he wrote a substantial minority report, and it also led, coincidentally, to the famous book that he wrote in 1955 called The Expenditure Tax. It also led him to become a tax advisor to several developing countries, starting with India in 1956, and then to Sri Lanka, to Mexico, to Turkey, to Venezuela, to Iran, a whole host of countries where often his proposals caused protests and riots. Nicky wasn't necessarily pleased, but he used to chuckle at that his proposals had caused such consternation. And then, of course, in the 1950s, he was also joint architect, along with Joan Robinson and Luigi Pazinetti and Richard Kahn, of what we now call the post-Keynesian school of growth and distribution theory, challenging neoclassical growth theory and extending Keynesian ideas to the long run. In the 1960s, he turned his attention to applied economics. In 1964, he'd already been appointed as a special advisor on tax matters to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jim Callaghan, in the Labour government of 1964 to 70. And I think it was that turned his mind away from pure theory in the 1950s into the applied economics of growth, because the United Kingdom at that time was the sort of sick man of Europe. It was the slowest growing economy of the whole of the European economies. And he gave this very famous lecture, his inaugural lecture in Cambridge in 1966, which was entitled The Causes of the Slow Rate of Growth of the United Kingdom Economy. And I'm going to say more about that lecture later on. In the 1970s, as Jamie was mentioning in his video speech, he led worldwide the intellectual assault on the doctrine of monetarism that had spread like the virulence of a plague from the United States of America under the influence of Milton Friedman. And what I argue is that he lost the battles, but he won the war. Because monetarism, Friedman monetarism Mark I is now dead, monetarism Mark II is now dead. And the book that, I'm not sure whether he referred to the book, but the book that came out of his evidence to the Treasury Select Committee, called The Scourge of Monetarism, is one of the best attacks, I think, that has ever been written on the doctrine of monetarism in the last century. And then in the 80s, he was mainly preoccupied with the challenge to equilibrium theory. And I think that there is going to be a session either this morning or this afternoon on this notion of, I think Gabor is going to talk, aren't you? No, not Gabor. Someone is going to talk about Kornai as well on this topic. Well, that's a brief biographical sketch. The Economist newspaper once described Nicky as the best known economist in the world not to have received the Nobel Prize. In 1969, when the announcement that there was going to be a Nobel Prize in economics, in the Financial Times, there was a list of 10 potential candidates, one of which indeed was Kaldor, but he never won the prize. But the best known economist in the world, maybe not to receive the Nobel Prize. Now, this isn't the first time there's been a conference on Kaldor in Hungary, because the 89 one was mentioned, but also there was one in 88, if I recall correctly. So there was one in 88, 89 to 91, a series of Kaldor seminars organized by Andrea Zago and Sandor Nagy. I don't know whether they're here in the audience, but there was this series of seminars. In fact, there was a Kaldor Foundation, of which John Kenneth Galbraith was the president. And as Jamie says, Galbraith and Kaldor were close friends. They knew each other well, particularly when Kaldor acted as the chief of the planning staff for the United Nations Strategic Bombing Survey in 1945. And I must quote this to you. John Kenneth Galbraith wrote a review of my biography of him in the Economic Journal after it was published, and he says, I quote, "I have often since imagined a regiment of soldiers of Kaldor's disposition. No commanding officer would have had any perceptible sense of authority. He would have been less at the mercy of the enemy than of his troops." Now, those who knew Nicky well can imagine very well what Galbraith meant. Disorganization was one of Nicky's endearing characteristics. Nicky was also very untidy. When I was in his house in Adams Road, sorting out his papers, I discovered all sorts of things hidden away in unexpected places, including, very interestingly, a typescript of the lectures that Nicky had taken from Alan Young at the LSE in 1928, which Nicky didn't know he had. Now, they are interesting from the point of the history of economic thought, because Alan Young, who'd come from Harvard, was the supervisor of Edward Chamberlain, of monopolistic competition fame. And Alan Young was teaching monopolistic competition at the LSE 5 years before the book came out. Those lectures, for those of you who are interested, are published in the Journal of Economic Studies for 1990, edited by Roger Sandilands. So now I'm going to tell you how I became a Kaldorian as a prelude to discussing Kaldor's insights into the applied economics of growth and development, in which two key words, structure and demand, matter for long-run growth, in contrast to neoclassical theory, which deals with a one-good economy in which structure and demand don't matter, and which factors of production and labour and capital and technical progress are exogenous. Now, what attracted my attention to Kaldor, first of all, were not the theoretical models of the 1950s, which were, as I say, purely theoretical, but this inaugural lecture that he gave in Cambridge in 1966, entitled The Causes of the Slow Rate of Growth of the United Kingdom Economy, followed by his Frank Pierce Memorial Lectures that he gave at Cornell University in the same year, which were published under the title of Strategic Factors in Economic Development. Now, in these lectures, he gives a structural, and that's the operative word, structural explanation of why growth rates differ between countries, singling out manufacturing industry as the engine of growth. Now, in the UK's case, he attributed Britain's slow rate of economic growth to a shortage of labour in manufacturing industry, because the reserves of labour in agriculture in the United Kingdom had dried up relative to the countries of Italy, France, Germany, and so on. And he described this as premature maturity, that is, running out of labour for industrial activity before a high level of productivity in industry had been reached. Now, in 1966, I was a young lecturer at the University of Kent at Canterbury, and I was looking for an intellectual home. And these lectures struck a chord with me, and I incorporated the ideas into my own lecture notes on growth and development theory. I believed him to be wrong that the basis of Britain's economic problem at that time was a shortage of labour in manufacturing industry. And indeed, this is one thing that Nicky changed his mind on when he was reminded that there were vast reserves of labour outside of manufacturing in the service sector, but not in his emphasis that the production characteristics of industry are different from the production characteristics of primary production, agriculture, or many service activities. Namely, that manufacturing is characterized by increasing returns, whereas primary production, agriculture, and many service activities are subject to constant or diminishing returns. And Kaldor's view, which he never changed, was that he thought it was impossible to understand growth rate differences between countries and levels of development between countries without making this fundamental distinction between increasing returns activities on the one hand and diminishing returns activities on the other, and which sort of activities countries specialize in. Now, out of these lectures came what are called Kaldor's growth laws, and there are three. So the first one simply states, that manufacturing is the engine of growth, not in the trivial sense that manufacturing, of course, is part of GDP, is part of total output, but in a causal sense. And why? And this is the second law, because manufacturing output growth induces productivity growth within the manufacturing sector itself, because of static returns to scale and dynamic returns to scale. And this is what is sometimes called Verdun's law. And the third law, the second explanation of this manufacturing is the engine of growth proposition, is that productivity growth outside of manufacturing is a positive function of manufacturing growth, because if there are diminishing returns outside the manufacturing sector, as labour is drawn into the manufacturing sector from these sectors outside, where the marginal product's below the average product, if you take the last man out, the average product rises. Now, our speaker mentioned Verdun. Verdun's law is named after P.J. Verdun, the Dutch economist who had published in an obscure Italian journal, in Italian, the journal Industria, research that he'd done across industries in the Eastern European countries that showed this positive relation between productivity growth on the one hand and manufacturing output growth on the other. Now, as was said, Verdun was a member of the research staff in Geneva between 1947 and 1949. But the interesting thing is that there had been no further research on the Verdun law post-1949, up until Nicky in 1966, and no one had even mentioned it in the literature on growth, except Ken Arrow, in his famous paper on learning by doing. But that is the only reference that you will find to Verdun's law. Well, my theory is that this idea must have lain dormant, as it were, in Nicky's head, and it resurfaced at the convenient time when he was writing this lecture on the role of manufacturing in economic growth in 1966. Well, since 1966, since that Kaldor inaugural lecture, there has been a massive amount of research on Verdun's law, and indeed in 1999 there was a conference in Genoa celebrating the 50th anniversary of the paper in 1949, and a book came out of that, edited by John Macombi, Maurizio Pugno, and Bruno Soro, entitled Productivity Growth and Economic Performance, Essays on Verdun's Law. In fact, all of the three of these laws have been extensively tested and have strong empirical support across developed countries, across developing countries, and also across regions within countries. I here give you just a brief sample of papers. There's this paper across the regions of China by Hansen and Zhang. There's a panel data study across developing countries by Nesmi. There's a study by Libanio across the countries of Latin America. And a friend and I did a paper in 2003 testing Kaldor's growth laws across the countries of Africa. We took a sample of about 46. Now these strong results have policy implications for particularly developing countries who want to accelerate their rate of economic progress. They have implications for the role of the state in promoting industry, industrial policy, the sorts of things that UNIDO in Vienna are concerned with. They have implications for the role of protection, countries protecting themselves, and what is the best way to protect if you want to affect structural change. Is it by subsidies? Is it by tariffs? Is it by directed credit or subsidized credit? What is it? And some of these issues may come up maybe in discussion later on this morning or this afternoon. The late Ajit Singh, some of you will know, the development economist at Cambridge, once said that as a student of Kaldor taught him three things. First of all, developing countries must industrialize. The only way that they can industrialize is by protection. If anyone says otherwise, they're being dishonest. So this was the first paper, the 66 one, that turned me into a Kaldorian. The second paper, which struck an intellectual chord with me, was his address to the Scottish Economic Society in 1970, and the paper he published then in the Scottish Journal of Political Economy called The Case for Regional Policy. Now, here at the regional level, he switches from the structure of production in a closed economy to the role of exports in an open context, where the growth of exports is considered the major component of autonomous demand for goods, which sets up a virtuous circle of growth, working indeed through the Verdun effect. Not dissimilar to Merdle's theory of circular and cumulative causation that Merdle had published in his book Economic Theory and Underdeveloped Regions in 1957. And this is one of his challenges to equilibrium theory, that free trade and free mobility of factors of production may not lead to an equilibrium with equalizing levels of unemployment or employment or wages or whatever across countries or regions. Structure matters, but it's now the demand characteristics of matter, not the supply characteristics of production. Now, if you read that paper, the model he puts forward is in purely verbal form. But a colleague and I, Robert Dixon, and I formalized the paper in 1975, entitled A Model of Regional Growth Rate Differences on Kaldorian Lines. And there are 4 equations. The first equation is indeed that the growth of output is a function gamma of the rate of growth of exports x. The rate of growth, equation 2, the rate of growth of exports is a function of how relative prices are changing, PDT minus PFT, times the price elasticity of demand for exports, eta, which is negative, and by how much income or expenditure is growing outside the region, which is ZT, where epsilon is the income elasticity of demand for exports. You then have a markup pricing equation where prices are based on a markup on unit labor costs. So if the profit margin remains the same, the rate of growth of prices, PDT, is equal to the rate of growth of wages minus the rate of growth of productivity. And then you have the 4th equation, which closes the 4-equation model, the Verdun relationship, where the rate of growth of productivity, RT, is equal to some autonomous term plus lambda, the Verdun coefficient, times the rate of growth of output, dt. Well, if you do the substitution process, you substitute equation 4 into 3, and the result into 2 and 1, you get the equilibrium growth of regional output as it is there. But we were also interested in the dynamics of this model. That is, if the system is out of equilibrium, does it return to an equilibrium or does it diverge further from it? So one of the ways you can make this model dynamic is to put a 1-period lag into any of the equations. We put a 1-period lag into the export demand equation. And the solution to the homogeneous part of this first-order difference equation is what you have here, equal to the initial condition times gamma eta lambda to the power t. Now, since eta is negative, and you've got a negative sign there, the whole expression is positive. So whether there's a divergence or convergence to equilibrium depends on the value of the parameters gamma, eta, lambda. If that value is greater than 1, of course, you get divergence from equilibrium. If it's less than 1, you get the growth of output converging to an equilibrium. Well, we argued in that paper that gamma, lambda, eta is probably less than 1 because the Verdun coefficient is normally estimated at about 0.5. Gamma will be about half if export growth is twice the rate of output growth. So you need an eta of -4 in order for that product to be greater than 1. Now, if you look at export demand functions, you very rarely find, indeed I've never seen, price elasticity demand for exports in an export demand function greater than 4. So what we argue is that that product is less than 1. So when you observe differences in regional growth rates or differences in country growth rates using this model, you're almost certainly observing, well, you may be observing some transitional dynamics, but you're observing differences in the equilibrium growth of the regions. And in fact, if there's no Verdun effect and there's no change in relative prices, equation 5 there reduces to gt equals epsilon zt. In other words, the growth of the region or the country is being driven by what output growth is outside the region or the country, multiplied by the income elasticity, which will reflect the production characteristics of the region or the country. Now, one of the weaknesses of this model, though, and Kaldor didn't consider this in this 1970 model, there's no balance of payments constraint in this model. But it's perfectly possible that the equilibrium of the model, the growth rate, brings in a rate of growth of imports which is greater than the rate of growth of exports, which is not sustainable. So one of the things we did was to put an import function into this model. Again, if you assume no Verdun effect and no relative price changes, the model equation 6 becomes GT equals epsilon ZT over pi, where pi is the income elasticity of demand for imports. And if you rearrange equation 7, you get the growth rate of one region or country, GT, relative to all others, ZT, as equal to the ratio of the income elasticity of demand for exports of the top region or country relative to the bottom. Now, actually, this is exactly, and this is one of the things I do in another paper, bring all these sort of center-periphery models together. This actually is the equation that you'll find in Prebisch's classic 1959 paper, where the rate of growth of the periphery, in his case, relative to the center, is equal to the ratio of the income elasticity of demand for primary commodities relative to the income elasticity of demand for manufactures. So, for example, if you say epsilon is 0.5 and pi is 2, then the periphery grows at 1/4 of the rate of growth of the center. Or in Prebisch's paper, he gives epsilon at 0.8, pi at 1.3. But anyway, Kaldor had a lot of time for Prebisch's views, and there's a similarity of their views. Now, the European Union at the moment might be regarded as the outcome of a classic center-periphery model. And, well, we talked about this at dinner last night, whether Nicky would have voted for Brexit or not, but he was definitely against the United Kingdom joining the EEC in 1973 for the very reasons that if you start disadvantaged as a country or a region, that disadvantage may become cumulative relative to the most successful. Well, now you may say that there's an uneasy connection between the closed economy model of growth rate differences based on the structure of production and the open economy models based on demand, where export growth is the driving force. And you'd be right. There is an uneasy connection, but it's easy to see that manufacturing as the engine of growth is also a reduced form of export-led growth, in which GDP growth is a function of export growth, but export growth is a function of manufacturing output growth. And I put this on in equation form here. Here you have the export growth equation, not 1, growth is a function of export growth. Export growth is a function of manufacturing growth because the income elasticity of demand for manufacturing goods is generally higher than others. And if you substitute 2 into 1, you see that the coefficient of G on GM is the product of B1 and B2. That is the coefficients on growth as a function of exports and growth and export growth as a function of the growth of manufacturing. Now, I've tested this model across 89 developing countries over the period 1990 to 2011, also for subsamples of low income, lower middle income, upper middle income, high income countries, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I'm not going to give you the slides, not going to give you the results, but here are some interesting slides. This is across 89 developing countries. And you see this strong association here between GDP growth and manufacturing growth, the Kaldor first law. Here you see how export growth and manufacturing growth, more loosely related, but nonetheless related. The faster your manufacturing output growth, the faster your export growth tends to be. And here is the relationship between GDP growth and export growth. The faster your export growth, the faster your GDP growth tends to be. Now, these results support very much the recent work of, I don't know whether you've seen it, of Roderick and Hausman on what you export matters, which show a very close association across countries between what they call XPY and growth rate differences between countries, where XPY is a weighted average of what they call ProdY, which is the country income level that the good is associated with. So if you're a poor country, for example, but producing sophisticated goods like China, you have a high ProdY, that feeds into a high XPY, and one of the reasons, therefore, why China grows much faster than you'd expect, given its level of development. So, what is my conclusion? My conclusion is that the message that Nikki has left us, and certainly with me, is that structure and demand matter for long-run economic growth. That was his basic message, in contrast to orthodox neoclassical growth theory, which is a one-good model in which structure and demand don't matter and factors of production are exogenously given. And I end with a nice photo of Nikki receiving an honorary degree from Sheffield at Frankfurt University. I think, I'm not sure the date, but I think 1983 maybe. But there we are, a great man, a lovely man, and Robert is going to tell you, I think, more about his vision and impressions of the man. So thank you very much.